I live in a city that's always moving, a place where ambition is the air you breathe. My apartment is a small sanctuary of calm in the chaos, a place I share with my cat, Apollo. By day, I'm a financial analyst, a job that suits my logical and meticulous nature, a skill that would soon become my greatest weapon. This story is about how a single, cruel sentence at a family dinner unraveled a lifetime of lies and led me to orchestrate a revenge that was as precise and calculated as the spreadsheets I manage every day. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The restaurant was exactly the kind of place my sister, Jessica, loved, ostentatiously expensive, with lighting so dim you could barely read the menu, and a hushed atmosphere that demanded a certain kind of behavior. It was the sort of place where appearances were everything, which, in hindsight, was the perfect setting for the implosion of our family's carefully constructed image. We were there to celebrate my father, David's, 58th birthday. He sat at the head of the table, a retired lawyer who still carried the courtroom's gravitas, accepting the toasts and praise with a practiced, magnanimous smile. My mother, Susan, a retired teacher, sat beside him, her expression a familiar blend of pride and gentle anxiety. She was the family's peacekeeper, a role that had grown more demanding over the years. I had spent weeks planning my gift. Knowing my father's penchant for grand gestures and his love for history, I had tracked down a rare, first-edition biography of his favorite historical figure. It was a thoughtful, deeply personal gift that had cost me a significant amount, but I knew, or I thought I knew, it would be appreciated. I watched as he unwrapped it, his initial polite smile turning into one of genuine surprise and delight. "Olivia, this is extraordinary," he said, his voice holding a rare note of unreserved warmth. "Truly. Thank you." For a fleeting moment, a sense of peace settled over me. It felt like a genuine family moment, a rare jewel in the often strained dynamic of our gatherings. That peace, however, was shattered the moment Jessica presented her gift. With a theatrical flourish, she produced a sleek box containing a ridiculously expensive watch, a brand known more for its celebrity endorsements than its craftsmanship. "Happy birthday, Daddy," she cooed, fastening it onto his wrist. "Only the best for you." David's reaction was effusive, his praise for the watch far exceeding the quiet appreciation he'd shown for my book. "Jessica, my dear, you've outdone yourself. Again." He shot her a look of pure adoration, a look I had spent my entire life trying to earn. I felt the familiar sting of being overshadowed, the quiet but persistent feeling of being second best. It was a role I had been cast in since childhood. Jessica was the biological daughter, the real one. I was the adopted one, a fact that was never a secret but was often used as a weapon, a subtle but sharp tool to remind me of my place. The evening wore on, a slow-moving parade of forced pleasantries and thinly veiled barbs, most of them launched from Jessica's side of the table. She spoke loudly about her recent promotion at her marketing firm, the lavish bonus she'd received, and the exotic vacation she was planning. Every sentence was a carefully crafted performance designed to highlight her success and, by extension, my perceived lack of it. My job as a financial analyst, while respectable and well-paying, was, in her eyes, hopelessly dull. It lacked the glamour of her world, the world she believed she was entitled to. My cousin, Mark, who was more like a brother to me, sat beside me, offering quiet support. A talented graphic designer, he understood the creative soul, but he also understood numbers, and more importantly, he understood people. He could see the tension coiling at the table, the storm brewing beneath the surface of my mother's forced smiles. He caught my eye and gave me a small, encouraging nod, a silent acknowledgement that he saw what was happening. It was a small comfort, but it was something. The main courses arrived, a collection of exquisitely plated but ridiculously small portions. As the waiter placed my dish in front of me, Jessica leaned across the table, her voice dripping with false concern. "Oh, Olivia, are you sure you should be eating that? You know how you have to watch your weight." I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. The comment was classic Jessica, a public criticism disguised as care. It was designed to embarrass me, to put me on the defensive. Before I could formulate a response, my mother jumped in, her voice a little too bright. "Now, Jessica, that's enough. Olivia looks wonderful." But there was no force behind her words, no real defense. It was the gentle chiding of a referee who had long ago lost control of the game. My father, engrossed in admiring his new watch, said nothing. His silence was, as always, the most damning response of all. It was a passive endorsement of Jessica's cruelty, a silent confirmation of my status as the family outsider. I pushed my food around my plate, my appetite gone. The weight of years of these small, cutting remarks pressed down on me. It was never one big thing, but 1,000 tiny cuts that had left me bleeding emotionally. I had always tried to rise above it, to be the bigger person, to prove my worth through my actions and my loyalty to the family. I had managed their finances, helped my parents with their retirement planning, and offered Jessica sound investment advice, which she had promptly ignored in favor of some get-rich-quick scheme a friend had suggested. I had done everything a good daughter was supposed to do, but it was never enough. I was not their daughter, not in the way that mattered. As the dessert menus were handed out, I felt a growing sense of dread. The evening was becoming unbearable, a slow-motion car crash of emotion and ego. I just wanted it to be over. I wanted to go home to my quiet apartment, to the unconditional affection of my cat, to a place where I didn't have to constantly justify my existence. But the worst was yet to come. The real betrayal was still waiting in the wings, ready to make its grand entrance. And when it did, it would be far more devastating than 1,000 cutting remarks about my weight or my career. It would be a blow aimed at the very core of my identity, a public declaration of my otherness, and it would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately burn our fragile family to the ground. The final act of the evening began, as most of our family dramas did, with a bill. The waiter, with the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to exorbitant tabs, placed the leather-bound folder in the center of the table. It lay there like an unexploded ordnance, a silent testament to an evening of excess. My father, as was tradition, reached for it. But Jessica, with a speed that was almost predatory, snatched it up first. "Allow me, Daddy," she said, her smile wide and dazzling. "It's your birthday, after all. My treat." My father beamed, his chest puffing out with pride. "That's my girl. Always so generous." I watched, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. Jessica's generosity was always transactional. It was never a gift, but an investment in her own image. She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the total. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of shock that I, and only I, seemed to notice. She had overplayed her hand. The bill, inflated by vintage wines and imported delicacies, was clearly more than she had anticipated. But her ego wouldn't let her back down. Not in front of this audience. She pulled out her platinum credit card, but instead of handing it to the waiter, she turned her gaze on me. Her eyes were cold, her smile now a sharp, cruel line. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet restaurant, "I think Olivia should get this. As a thank you for, everything." The table fell silent. The ambiguity of her statement hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My father looked confused. "Jessica, what are you talking about? It's my birthday. You said it was your treat." "Oh, it is," she said, her voice now syrupy sweet. "I'm treating my family. The real family." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the words sink in. Then, she turned her full attention to me. The final, fatal blow. "Olivia, you've been a part of this family for a long time, and we're all very fond of you. But you're not really one of us, are you? You're adopted. You came from somewhere else. So, why don't you be a dear and go find another table? And since you're so good with money, you can handle this." With a flick of her wrist, she slid the bill across the polished wood of the table. It stopped directly in front of my plate. I stared at it, the numbers swimming before my eyes. $3,270. It wasn't just a bill, it was a declaration. A public, humiliating, and unequivocal statement of my otherness. It was a price tag placed on my inclusion in the family, a debt I was now expected to pay for the privilege of their company. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at my father, my eyes pleading with him to say something, to intervene, to defend me. He looked from me to Jessica, his expression a mixture of shock and a cowardice I had seen too many times before. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He did nothing. He said nothing. His silence was a betrayal far deeper than Jessica's words. It was an abdication of his role as a father, a confirmation that, in his heart, he agreed with her. I then looked at my mother. Tears were welling in her eyes, her hand fluttering to her throat. "Jessica, that's a horrible thing to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. But there was no anger in her tone, no outrage. Just a weak, pleading sound. It was the protest of a woman who had long ago surrendered her power, a woman who chose peace over justice, even when her own daughter was being crucified in front of her. Mark was the only one who reacted with the fury the moment deserved. He pushed his chair back, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "Are you out of your mind, Jessica?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "What is wrong with you?" Jessica simply shrugged, a picture of unconcerned cruelty. "I'm just stating a fact. Olivia isn't blood. She's an outsider. She's always been an outsider." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I felt the air rush out of my lungs. All the years of trying, of striving, of hoping to be enough, they all collapsed in that single, brutal moment. I wasn't just being excluded, I was being erased. My entire life, my identity as a daughter and a sister, was being reduced to a transaction, a bill to be paid. My hands were shaking, but a strange, cold calm began to settle over me. The shock was giving way to something else, something harder and more resolute. I looked at the faces around the table, Jessica's smug triumph, my father's weak avoidance, my mother's tearful helplessness. And I realized, with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating, that this was not my family. They were not my people. I had been living in a house of cards, and Jessica had just done me the favor of blowing it down. Slowly, deliberately, I picked up the bill. My eyes met Jessica's. There was no hatred in my gaze, no anger. Just a cold, empty finality. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not make a scene. I simply stood up, my movements precise and controlled. I took out my own credit card, the one I used for emergencies, and placed it in the folder with the bill. Then, I looked at the group of people I had spent my entire life trying to please. "You're right, Jessica," I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the thick silence. "I'm not one of you. And I have never been more grateful for that fact than I am at this moment." I turned to my father. "Happy birthday, David." The use of his first name was a deliberate choice, a severing of the final tie. "I hope the watch keeps good time. You're going to need it to count the minutes of your regret." I gave a final, sad look to my mother, a silent farewell to the woman who had failed to protect me. Then, I turned to Mark. "I'm leaving. Are you coming with me?" He didn't hesitate. He stood up, throwing his napkin onto the table in disgust. "I'm right behind you, Liv." Without another word, I walked away. I didn't look back. I could feel their eyes on me, but I didn't care. As I walked through the opulent restaurant, past the curious glances of other diners, I felt a strange sense of lightness. The weight of their expectations, the burden of their conditional love, was gone. I had been publicly humiliated, but in that humiliation, I had found a freedom I had never known. The $3,270 was a staggering amount of money, an insult of epic proportions. But as I walked out into the cool night air, I knew it was the best money I had ever spent. It was the price of my emancipation. And as the anger began to subside, it was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They had drawn a line in the sand. They had quantified my worth and handed me the bill. Now, it was my turn to do some accounting of my own. And I, the financial analyst, the one who was so good with numbers, was about to make them pay. Every last cent. The days following the disastrous birthday dinner were a blur of numb disbelief and simmering rage. I went through the motions of my life, work, exercise, feeding the cat, but my mind was a whirlwind of replayed conversations and shattered memories. The cruelty of Jessica's words, the weakness of my parents' silence, it was a wound that refused to close. Mark was my rock during this time. He called me every day, his voice a comforting presence in the deafening silence left by my so-called family. He was furious on my behalf, his anger a warm and validating fire that helped to burn away some of my own pain. "I can't believe them, Liv," he said during one of our calls. "To do that to you, in public, it's monstrous." It was clarifying, I replied, my voice flat. It told me everything I needed to know. And it had. The illusion of family had been stripped away, revealing the ugly truth beneath. They had never seen me as their own. I was a guest in their lives, a long-term visitor whose welcome had finally expired. The $3,270 bill was not just an insult, it was my severance package. Once the initial shock began to fade, my grief curdled into a cold, hard anger. But I am not a person who deals in loud, explosive emotions. My anger is a quiet, methodical thing. It is the anger of a strategist, a planner, an analyst. I had spent my entire career finding patterns in chaos, making sense of complex financial data. And now, I was going to apply those skills to my own life. My revenge would not be a screaming match or a dramatic confrontation. It would be quiet, precise, and devastating. It would be a dismantling of the facade they had built their lives upon. And I knew exactly where to start, their finances. For years, I had been the family's unofficial financial advisor. I had set up my parents' retirement accounts, managed their investment portfolio, and helped them navigate the complexities of tax law. I had access to everything, their bank statements, their investment records, their wills. It was a position of trust, a trust they had just casually and cruelly betrayed. And in that betrayal, they had made a critical mistake. They had forgotten who they were dealing with. They had handed the keeper of their secrets the very weapon she needed to destroy them. I started with a simple audit. I locked myself in my home office, Apollo purring softly on a stack of papers, and began to pull up the files. I had always handled their finances with the utmost professionalism, treating their money with more care than I treated my own. I had assumed they were living comfortably, their wealth managed prudently, their retirement secure. I had assumed the image they presented to the world, of a successful lawyer and his comfortable family, was real. It did not take long to discover that it was all a lie. The first red flag was the credit card statements. My father, the supposedly responsible retired lawyer, was spending money like a man half his age with a trust fund. There were charges for lavish dinners, expensive suits, and regular, significant cash withdrawals from ATMs near a part of town known for its discreet gentlemen's clubs. It was a pattern of reckless, self-indulgent spending that was completely at odds with his retirement income. But the real shock came when I looked at their investment portfolio. I had structured it carefully, a balanced mix of stocks and bonds designed for steady, long-term growth. Or so I thought. When I logged into the account, my blood ran cold. The portfolio had been gutted. Large blocks of stable, blue-chip stocks had been sold off. The proceeds had not been reinvested. They had been transferred to a personal checking account, an account I did not recognize. I dug deeper, my fingers flying across the keyboard, my heart pounding in my chest. I followed the money trail, a digital breadcrumb path that led me to a series of increasingly reckless and foolish investments. My father, it seemed, had been taking financial advice from someone other than me. He had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into speculative tech startups, risky foreign currency exchanges, and even, to my utter disbelief, a cryptocurrency scheme that screamed Ponzi from a mile away. The losses were staggering. He had burned through nearly half of their retirement savings, chasing high-risk, high-reward fantasies. The successful, financially savvy image he projected was a complete fabrication. He was a gambler, and a bad one at that. He had been playing Russian roulette with their future, and the chamber was almost empty. But he wasn't the only one with secrets. My investigation then turned to Jessica. She had always been secretive about her own finances, deflecting any questions with a vague reference to her generous salary and lucrative bonuses. I had always respected her privacy, but that respect was now a casualty of her own cruelty. Using some of the skills I'd picked up in my line of work, and perhaps bending a few ethical rules, a transgression I felt entirely justified in making, I began to look into her financial situation. It was even worse than I had imagined. Jessica, the marketing maven, the embodiment of success and glamour, was drowning in debt. Her platinum credit card, the one she had so theatrically produced at the restaurant, was maxed out. She had personal loans, a car lease she couldn't afford, and a shopping addiction that was truly breathtaking in its scope. Her apartment, which I had always assumed she owned, was a rental, and she was 3 months behind on the rent. The source of her generous income was the most damning discovery of all. For the past 2 years, she had been receiving large, regular payments from our parents. They were propping up her lavish lifestyle, funding her illusion of success, while their own retirement savings dwindled to dangerously low levels. They were enabling her fantasy at the expense of their own future. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. The dinner, the extravagant watch, the public humiliation, it all made a sick kind of sense now. Jessica was desperate. She needed to maintain the illusion of wealth and success, both for her own ego and to continue bleeding our parents dry. My thoughtful, personal gift to my father had been a threat to that illusion. It had highlighted the difference between genuine sentiment and empty materialism. My very presence, my quiet competence, my financial stability, it was a constant, infuriating reminder of her own failures. She needed to put me back in my place, to re-establish the family hierarchy with her at the top. The adopted outsider, the charity case, couldn't be allowed to outshine the golden child. She had to make me small so she could feel big. I leaned back in my chair, the screen of my laptop illuminating the dark room. The anger was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. But it was now mingled with a sense of profound pity. They were not monsters. They were just pathetic. A family built on a foundation of lies, debt, and illusion. Their entire lives were a financial facade, a carefully constructed illusion of wealth and happiness that was about to come crashing down. And I was the one who was going to push it over. I had all the information I needed. I had their secrets, their lies, their vulnerabilities. The question was no longer what to do, but when. The revenge I was planning was no longer just about settling a score. It was about exposing the truth. It was about holding up a mirror to their faces and forcing them to see the ugly, pathetic reality they had tried so hard to hide. The final family dinner had been a disaster. The next one, I decided, would be a reckoning. And I would be the one setting the table. The next few weeks were a period of intense, clandestine activity. By day, I was Olivia, the diligent financial analyst, my colleagues oblivious to the storm raging within me. By night, I was a forensic accountant of my own family's ruin, piecing together the full, sordid story of their financial self-destruction. The initial discoveries had been shocking, but as I delved deeper, I uncovered a web of deceit and foolishness that was more extensive than I could have ever imagined. My first task was to create a comprehensive, undeniable record of their financial mismanagement. This couldn't be based on assumptions or accusations, it had to be a cold, hard presentation of the facts. I began to compile a dossier, a detailed report that would serve as the centerpiece of my eventual confrontation. I downloaded and organized years of bank statements, credit card bills, and investment reports. I created spreadsheets that tracked every dollar spent, every reckless investment made, every secret transfer executed. The data formed a narrative, a story of decline and desperation. The trail of my father's bad investments was a particularly sad and infuriating path to follow. I traced the money from their joint savings account to the series of high-risk ventures. I found the emails he had exchanged with slick, persuasive investment gurus who had promised him astronomical returns. He had fallen for every classic trick in the book: the Nigerian prince scams, the guaranteed stock tips, the non-existent tech companies. He, the brilliant lawyer, the man who had built a career on logic and reason, had been played for a fool. His pride and his greed had made him an easy mark. The most painful discovery was the extent to which he had raided funds meant for my mother's future. He had cashed out an annuity in her name, forging her signature on the withdrawal forms. The penalty for early withdrawal was steep, but he had paid it without hesitation, all to fund his next big gamble. It was a betrayal not just of me, but of the woman he had promised to protect. He had sacrificed her security for his own ego. Jessica's financial trail was less about foolishness and more about a deep, insatiable vanity. Her bank statements were a litany of designer boutiques, high-end salons, and exclusive restaurants. She was living a life she couldn't afford, a life funded by our parents' dwindling resources. I cross-referenced the dates of the large transfers from my parents' account with her major purchases. A $10,000 transfer in March was followed by a shopping spree in Paris. A $5,000 loan in July coincided with a down payment on a luxury car she had no business driving. It was a parasitic relationship. Jessica provided the illusion of a successful, glamorous daughter, and in return, my parents gave her the money to maintain that illusion. They were all complicit in the lie. Her success was their success, a validation of their parenting, a way to keep up appearances in their social circle. The truth, that their daughter was a financial black hole, a woman-child incapable of living within her means, was too shameful to admit. My role in this charade became painfully clear. I was the responsible one, the stable one, the one who actually made sound financial decisions. But my stability was not a source of pride for them, it was a utility. I was the safety net, the one who managed the boring but essential parts of their finances so they could indulge their fantasies. I was the family's unpaid financial manager, and my compensation was the occasional pat on the head and a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome. As I compiled the evidence, I knew that simply presenting it to them would not be enough. A confrontation would lead to denials, excuses, and emotional manipulation. I needed more than just the truth, I needed leverage. And that's when I remembered the will. Years ago, I had helped my father draft his and my mother's wills. I was named as the executor, another responsibility placed on my capable shoulders. I had a copy of the documents stored securely on a password-protected hard drive. I pulled up the file, my heart beating a little faster. I remembered the main clauses, but I needed to be sure. There it was, in black and white. The estate was to be divided equally between their two children, Jessica and me. But there was a specific clause, one that I had suggested at the time, thinking it was a prudent and sensible measure. It was an inheritance advance clause. It stipulated that any significant financial gifts or loans given to one child during their lifetimes could be deducted from that child's share of the final inheritance. At the time, it seemed like a fair way to ensure equity. Now, it was the key to my entire plan. The loans to Jessica were not well documented. They were informal transfers, a daughter asking for help from her loving parents. But I was a financial analyst. I could create the documentation. The bank transfers were the proof of payment. The corresponding extravagant purchases were the proof of purpose. I could build a case, a solid, undeniable financial argument that these were not gifts, but advances on her inheritance. And I, as the executor, would be the one to enforce that clause. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. My revenge would not just be emotional, it would be financial. It would be a legal and binding rebalancing of the scales. Jessica had handed me a bill for $3,270, a symbolic price for my place in the family. I was about to hand her a bill for hundreds of thousands of dollars, the very real price of her deception and greed. With my dossier complete and my strategy in place, I felt a sense of calm and purpose I hadn't felt since that night at the restaurant. This was no longer just about anger. It was about justice. It was about accountability. They had treated me like a line item on a budget, an expense to be tolerated. They had dismissed my skills, my knowledge, and my loyalty. Now, they were going to see the true value of a financial analyst who had been pushed too far. The money trail had led me to the heart of their lies. And now, it was going to lead me to my victory. The final reckoning was coming, and it was going to be perfectly, beautifully, and ruinously calculated. With the dossier complete, a thick binder filled with spreadsheets, bank statements, and a meticulously crafted narrative of financial ruin, the time for planning was over. It was time for action. My plan was not a single, dramatic confrontation, but a series of calculated moves designed to dismantle their world brick by brick, leaving them with no one to blame but themselves. The inheritance gambit was the core of my strategy, but it needed to be executed with precision. My first move was to quietly and professionally resign from my position as their financial manager. I drafted a formal letter, printed it on high-quality paper, and sent it via certified mail. The letter was polite, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. It stated that, due to a change in my personal circumstances, I would no longer be able to manage their financial affairs, effective immediately. I provided a list of their account numbers, login information, and a recommendation that they seek the services of a qualified, independent financial advisor. I gave no explanation, no hint of the storm that was coming. I simply quit. The reaction was immediate. My phone started ringing off the hook. First, my mother, her voice laced with a frantic, bewildered panic. "Olivia, what is this? What's going on? Did we do something wrong?" Her feigned ignorance was almost laughable. I let the call go to voicemail. Next, my father. His tone was not one of concern, but of anger and entitlement. "Olivia, call me back immediately. You can't just abandon your responsibilities like this. We depend on you." His message was a perfect encapsulation of their worldview. My help was not a gift, but an obligation. I ignored his call as well. Jessica, surprisingly, did not call. I suspected she was either too arrogant to believe my withdrawal would affect her, or too busy spending the last of our parents' money. My silence was a deliberate tactic. I was creating a vacuum. For years, I had been the one to handle the bills, balance the checkbooks, and navigate the complexities of their finances. By removing myself from the equation, I was forcing them to confront the mess they had created. I knew that without my guidance, it wouldn't take long for the cracks in their financial facade to become gaping chasms. A week later, Mark called me. He had spoken to my mother. The panic was escalating. A property tax bill had arrived that they didn't know how to pay. An investment statement had come in the mail with numbers that made no sense to them. They were adrift, and they were starting to get scared. "They're completely lost, Lave," Mark said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "They had no idea how much you were doing for them." "They're about to find out," I replied, my voice calm. My next step was to secure my legal position. I consulted with a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in estate law. I laid out the entire situation for her, presenting my dossier of financial evidence and the copies of my parents' wills. I did not frame it as a revenge plot, but as a concerned daughter and a diligent executor seeking to fulfill her future duties. She reviewed the inheritance advance clause. "This is ironclad," she said, tapping the document with her pen. "The language is clear. Any significant financial disbursements can be treated as an advance. Your documentation here," she gestured to my dossier, "is incredibly thorough. You've built a powerful case. She advised me to formalize the evidence. She suggested I draft a series of promissory notes for each of the major loans to Jessica, dating them to coincide with the transfers. While they would be unsigned, they would serve as a clear record of my parents' intent, an intent I, as the person who had managed their finances for years, was uniquely qualified to interpret. It was a legally gray area, but morally, I felt perfectly justified. I was simply creating the paperwork that should have existed all along. The final piece of my plan was the most audacious. I needed to protect what little was left of my parents' assets, both for their own future and to ensure there was an inheritance left to divide. With the power of attorney I still held, a document they had forgotten I possessed, I made a series of swift, decisive moves. I logged into their investment account one last time. I sold off the remaining garbage stocks, the cryptocurrency, and all the other high-risk garbage my father had bought. I absorbed the losses, which were significant, but my goal was to stop the bleeding. I transferred the remaining capital into a stable, low-yield, and, most importantly, untouchable trust. I structured it in such a way that they would receive a small, fixed monthly stipend, enough to live on, but not enough to fund their extravagant lifestyles. The principal was locked away, protected from their own worst impulses. Then, I turned to the house. They owned it outright, their single most valuable asset. Using my power of attorney, I placed a lien on the property. The lien was in my name, and the amount was for the total sum of the advances made to Jessica. It was a bold move, but a necessary one. It meant they could not sell or borrow against the house without paying me first. I was effectively freezing their largest asset, turning it into a guarantee against Jessica's debt. With all the pieces in place, the trap was set. They were financially isolated, their assets frozen or locked away, and a mountain of evidence was compiled against them. They were living on borrowed time, the comfortable world they had built on a foundation of lies and my unpaid labor about to be foreclosed upon. All that was left was the final act. I needed a stage, a moment where the full weight of their actions could be brought to bear. Another family dinner, I decided, was the only fitting venue. But this time, it would be on my terms. In my territory. And I would be the one presenting the bill. I sent a simple, forward text message to my mother, father, and sister, "We need to talk." Then, I sent them the address of a modest, quiet restaurant near my apartment. A place where the truth could be served, cold and unvarnished. The final reckoning was at hand. The restaurant I chose was the antithesis of the one where my humiliation had taken place. It was a small, family-owned Italian place, brightly lit, with checkered tablecloths and the warm, comforting smell of garlic and oregano. There were no hushed tones or judgmental glances here. It was a place for honest conversations, a place where appearances didn't matter. It was my turf. I arrived early and chose a table in a quiet corner. I laid out 4 simple folders on the table, one for each of us. Mine contained my copy of the dossier. The other 3 were for them. They arrived together, a united front of anxiety and apprehension. My father looked older, the stress of the past few weeks having etched new lines onto his face. My mother's eyes were puffy, and she wrung her hands nervously. Jessica was the last to walk in, her usual confident swagger replaced by a tense, defensive posture. She was still dressed immaculately, but the designer clothes looked like a costume, a fragile armor against a battle she knew was coming but didn't understand. They sat down, the silence thick with unspoken accusations. My father was the first to speak, his voice attempting a blustering authority that no longer had any power. "Olivia, what is the meaning of this? Locking us out of our own accounts? Putting a lien on our house? Have you lost your mind?" I didn't answer him. I simply pushed the folders across the table toward them. "Everything you need to know is in there," I said, my voice calm and even. "I suggest you read it carefully." Hesitantly, they opened the folders. Inside, I had prepared a personalized summary for each of them. For my parents, a detailed breakdown of their financial situation, the depleted retirement accounts, the massive losses from my father's gambling, the forged signature on the annuity withdrawal, and a clear accounting of the money they had funneled to Jessica over the years. For Jessica, her folder contained a full accounting of her own debt, the maxed-out credit cards, the personal loans, and, most importantly, a complete list of the advances she had received from our parents, totaling a staggering $287,450. At the back of her folder was a copy of the promissory notes I had drafted and a copy of the inheritance advance clause from the will. I watched their faces as they read. My mother's expression shifted from confusion to horror, tears welling in her eyes as she saw the full extent of my father's deception. My father's face went pale, the bluster draining away to be replaced by a sickly, gray shame. He couldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the papers, at the undeniable proof of his failure. But it was Jessica's reaction that was the most satisfying. Her face twisted into a mask of disbelief, then rage. She threw the folder down on the table, the papers scattering. "This is insane. It's a lie. My parents gave me that money. It was a gift." "Was it a gift, Jessica?" I asked, my voice still quiet. "Or was it the price of your silence? The price of maintaining the illusion that you were a success, while you were actually a financial parasite, draining them dry?" I turned my gaze to my parents. "Did you know she was 3 months behind on her rent? That she was about to have her car repossessed? Or did you just keep writing checks, too afraid to admit that your golden child was a complete and utter failure?" The truth of my words hung in the air, undeniable and devastating. My mother began to sob quietly, a broken, defeated sound. My father simply stared at his hands, his shoulders slumped. He was a king whose kingdom had been revealed to be a molehill of debt. Jessica, however, was not defeated. She was cornered, and she came out fighting, her words laced with the same venom she had used at the birthday dinner. "You did this. This is all your fault. You were always jealous of me, always trying to turn them against me. You're not even a real part of this family. You have no right." And there it was. The core of it all. The wound she had inflicted, the one she thought was still my greatest weakness. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto hers. And for the first time, I let the full force of my cold, controlled anger show. "You're right, Jessica. I'm not a real part of this family. And thank God for that. Because this family is a lie. It's a house of cards built on debt, deceit, and pathetic delusions. And you are the queen of that pathetic little kingdom." I stood up, my own folder in my hand. "Let me explain the new reality to you. I have resigned as your financial manager. The remaining assets are now in a trust, which will provide Mom and Dad with a modest living stipend. The house has a lien on it in my name for the $287,450 you owe the estate. That means you can't sell it or borrow against it until that debt is repaid. And according to the will, which I will execute to the letter, that entire amount will be deducted from your share of the inheritance." I let that sink in. I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the dawning, horrific realization of what I had done. "As for me," I continued, my voice clear and strong, "I am owed nothing. I want nothing from you. Except for one thing." I pulled a final piece of paper from my folder. It was a credit card statement. My credit card statement. I circled the charge from that night at the restaurant. $3,270, I said. "You handed me this bill and told me to find another table. And I did. But you will be paying this back. Consider it the first installment on your very large, and very real, debt." I placed the statement on the table in front of her. "I have done the accounting. The books are now balanced. From this moment on, you are on your own. All of you." I turned and walked away, leaving them sitting in stunned silence amidst the wreckage of their lives. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the finality of the moment, the satisfying, clean break of a bond that had been toxic for far too long. As I stepped out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, I felt no triumph, no joy. Just a quiet, profound sense of release. The final reckoning was over. The debt had been settled. And I was finally, completely, and irrevocably free. The restaurant I chose was the antithesis of the one where my humiliation had taken place. It was a small, family-owned Italian place, brightly lit, with checkered tablecloths and the warm, comforting smell of garlic and oregano. There were no hushed tones or judgmental glances here. It was a place for honest conversations, a place where appearances didn't matter. It was my turf. I arrived early and chose a table in a quiet corner. I laid out 4 simple folders on the table, one for each of us. Mine contained my copy of the dossier. The other 3 were for them. They arrived together, a united front of anxiety and apprehension. My father looked older, the stress of the past few weeks having etched new lines onto his face. My mother's eyes were puffy, and she wrung her hands nervously. Jessica was the last to walk in, her usual confident swagger replaced by a tense, defensive posture. She was still dressed immaculately, but the designer clothes looked like a costume, a fragile armor against a battle she knew was coming but didn't understand. They sat down, the silence thick with unspoken accusations. My father was the first to speak, his voice attempting a blustering authority that no longer had any power. "Olivia, what is the meaning of this? Locking us out of our own accounts? Putting a lien on our house? Have you lost your mind?" I didn't answer him. I simply pushed the folders across the table toward them. "Everything you need to know is in there," I said, my voice calm and even. "I suggest you read it carefully." Hesitantly, they opened the folders. Inside, I had prepared a personalized summary for each of them. For my parents, a detailed breakdown of their financial situation, the depleted retirement accounts, the massive losses from my father's gambling, the forged signature on the annuity withdrawal, and a clear accounting of the money they had funneled to Jessica over the years. For Jessica, her folder contained a full accounting of her own debt, the maxed-out credit cards, the personal loans, and, most importantly, a complete list of the advances she had received from our parents, totaling a staggering $287,450. At the back of her folder was a copy of the promissory notes I had drafted and a copy of the inheritance advance clause from the will. I watched their faces as they read. My mother's expression shifted from confusion to horror, tears welling in her eyes as she saw the full extent of my father's deception. My father's face went pale, the bluster draining away to be replaced by a sickly, gray shame. He couldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the papers, at the undeniable proof of his failure. But it was Jessica's reaction that was the most satisfying. Her face twisted into a mask of disbelief, then rage. She threw the folder down on the table, the papers scattering. "This is insane. It's a lie. My parents gave me that money. It was a gift." "Was it a gift, Jessica?" I asked, my voice still quiet. "Or was it the price of your silence? The price of maintaining the illusion that you were a success, while you were actually a financial parasite, draining them dry?" I turned my gaze to my parents. "Did you know she was 3 months behind on her rent? That she was about to have her car repossessed? Or did you just keep writing checks, too afraid to admit that your golden child was a complete and utter failure?" The truth of my words hung in the air, undeniable and devastating. My mother began to sob quietly, a broken, defeated sound. My father simply stared at his hands, his shoulders slumped. He was a king whose kingdom had been revealed to be a molehill of debt. Jessica, however, was not defeated. She was cornered, and she came out fighting, her words laced with the same venom she had used at the birthday dinner. "You did this. This is all your fault. You were always jealous of me, always trying to turn them against me. You're not even a real part of this family. You have no right." And there it was. The core of it all. The wound she had inflicted, the one she thought was still my greatest weakness. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto hers. And for the first time, I let the full force of my cold, controlled anger show. "You're right, Jessica. I'm not a real part of this family. And thank God for that. Because this family is a lie. It's a house of cards built on debt, deceit, and pathetic delusions. And you are the queen of that pathetic little kingdom." I stood up, my own folder in my hand. "Let me explain the new reality to you. I have resigned as your financial manager. The remaining assets are now in a trust, which will provide Mom and Dad with a modest living stipend. The house has a lien on it in my name for the $287,450 you owe the estate. That means you can't sell it or borrow against it until that debt is repaid. And according to the will, which I will execute to the letter, that entire amount will be deducted from your share of the inheritance." I let that sink in. I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the dawning, horrific realization of what I had done. "As for me," I continued, my voice clear and strong, "I am owed nothing. I want nothing from you. Except for one thing." I pulled a final piece of paper from my folder. It was a credit card statement. My credit card statement. I circled the charge from that night at the restaurant. $3,270, I said. "You handed me this bill and told me to find another table. And I did. But you will be paying this back. Consider it the first installment on your very large, and very real, debt." I placed the statement on the table in front of her. "I have done the accounting. The books are now balanced. From this moment on, you are on your own. All of you." I turned and walked away, leaving them sitting in stunned silence amidst the wreckage of their lives. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the finality of the moment, the satisfying, clean break of a bond that had been toxic for far too long. As I stepped out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, I felt no triumph, no joy. Just a quiet, profound sense of release. The final reckoning was over. The debt had been settled. And I was finally, completely, and irrevocably free. The aftermath of the final reckoning was not a sudden, dramatic explosion, but a slow, quiet collapse. I had set the dominoes in motion, and all I had to do was step back and watch them fall. I blocked their numbers, set up a filter on my email to send their messages directly to the trash, and instructed my lawyer to be my sole point of contact for any family matters. I had said everything I needed to say. The silence that followed was a balm to my soul. Mark kept me updated, acting as a reluctant but necessary intermediary. The news he relayed was a predictable tale of decline. My parents, forced to live on the modest stipend from the trust, had to make drastic changes to their lifestyle. The country club membership was the first to go, followed by the expensive cars. They had to learn to live within a budget for the first time in their lives, a humbling and, from what Mark said, deeply distressing experience for them. My mother, stripped of her role as a socialite, seemed lost. My father, his ego shattered, retreated into a bitter, resentful silence. They had been forced to confront the reality of their situation, and they did not like what they saw. Jessica's downfall was far more spectacular. Without the endless flow of cash from our parents, her house of cards collapsed with breathtaking speed. She was evicted from her apartment, her luxury car was repossessed, and her credit score, already in tatters, plummeted into the abyss. She lost her job, unable to maintain the image of success her marketing career demanded. The last Mark heard, she had moved in with a friend and was working a retail job at the mall, the ultimate humiliation for someone so obsessed with status and glamour. She had tried to contest the lien on the house, but my lawyer had shut her down swiftly and decisively. The evidence was irrefutable. The debt was hers to bear. I took no pleasure in their suffering. My goal was never to destroy them, but to force them to take accountability for their actions. I had exposed the truth, and the consequences were simply the natural result of a lifetime of poor choices. Their ruin was of their own making. I was merely the auditor who had presented the final, damning report. While their world was shrinking, mine was expanding. The energy I had once poured into managing their lives and navigating their toxic dynamics was now my own. I focused on my career, taking on more challenging projects at work and earning a significant promotion. I reconnected with old friends, the ones I had neglected in my single-minded devotion to a family that had never truly been mine. I started dating again, meeting a kind and funny man who valued me for who I was, not what I could do for him. The $3,270 that Jessica had tried to use as a weapon against me became a symbol of my liberation. I framed the credit card receipt and hung it in my home office, a reminder of the day I bought my freedom. It was the best investment I had ever made. About a year after the final dinner, I received a letter from my mother. It had been sent through my lawyer, the only way she could reach me. It was a short, simple letter, written on plain stationery. In it, she apologized. It was not a perfect apology, it was full of excuses and self-pity. But for the first time, she acknowledged her role in my pain. She admitted her weakness, her failure to stand up for me. She said she was sorry. She did not ask for forgiveness or a reconciliation. She simply stated her regret. I read the letter several times, then put it away. It did not change anything, but it did offer a small sense of closure. It was the acknowledgement I had needed, even if it had come far too late. I never heard from my father or Jessica again. Their silence was its own kind of message, a final, stubborn refusal to admit their own culpability. I was at peace with that. I no longer needed their validation or their approval. I had found my own worth on my own terms. My new life is quiet, but it is real. It is built on a foundation of honesty, self-respect, and genuine affection. I have a chosen family now, a circle of friends who love and support me unconditionally. I have a partner who sees me, truly sees me, and a career that I find fulfilling. I still have Apollo, my faithful feline companion, a constant source of comfort and quiet joy. Sometimes, when I'm working late in my office, I'll glance at the framed receipt on the wall. I don't feel anger anymore. I don't feel a desire for revenge. I just feel a quiet sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the life I have built, for the peace I have found, and for the strength I discovered within myself. Jessica meant for that bill to be the end of my story, a final, humiliating chapter. But she was wrong. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. It was the day I stopped being their adopted daughter and started being myself. It was the day I found a new table, a new life, and a new family. And for that, I will be forever grateful.